Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Internet Scrum Master. I have over 20 years experience in tech and finance. I've worked across service desk, QA, server and application administration, and release management. And for the past decade, I've been a full-time Scrum Master. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're talking complementary practices in Scrum. Many of the things that come to mind first when people hear the word Scrum aren't part of the framework at all. They are complementary practices. A complementary practice refers to anything you do as part of your Scrum implementation that isn't mentioned in the Scrum Guide. Here are a few very common things that aren't part of Scrum. We're going to look at each of these today. Chapter markers are below. Let's start with one of the most common practices in Scrum, user stories. Why are they so common? Well, I would say the single biggest reason is that they are the default ticket type in Jira and Azure DevOps. They are the default ticket type because the community had been using user stories for a long time before these tools were developed. But it does illustrate how a good idea for a lot of people turns into a standard for all of the people. From that perspective, I don't like it because what happens, companies, teams spin up a Jira instance, see user stories in there, and if they don't know any better, if they haven't had a lot of training in Scrum, then they're going to just assume that that is the requirement and that they have to do that. And it may be a good idea. There are a lot of advantages to using them, but they're not required, and that's really the point I'm trying to make here. Let's get clear on what a user story is. Because yeah, it isn't just a ticket type, or at least it isn't supposed to be. A user story is meant to be a small slice of functionality told from the perspective of a user. And it's usually written like this. As a member of the call center support team, I need to search customer profiles by phone number so that I can quickly locate records during incoming calls. So the first thing to notice here is there are no instructions for the development team telling them any sort of technical requirements, no telling them what database to use or what front end they might need. In this case, there's probably already a predefined front end and database, but it isn't part of the user story. That being said, if there wasn't already an architecture in place, the user story isn't going to define that architecture either. The development team is going to look at that and they're going to say, okay, we don't have an architecture for this. What sort of architecture do we want to put in place? They may need to engage another team, a dedicated architecture team, and that's just going to be dependent on your organization. Some teams will have the development team, the Scrum team, build out the architecture themselves. That's probably going to happen more in smaller organizations. Regardless, the user stories should originate with the product owner based on research and conversations, interviews, customer feedback, other data they might have. So if user stories aren't part of Scrum, where did they come from? User stories came from extreme programming, or XP, a development methodology from the late 90s. You don't hear a lot about XP these days, but if you are doing Scrum, odds are you're practicing one or more XP practices without realizing it. So XP gave us test-driven development, pair programming, and continuous integration, among others. But like I said, user stories are optional in Scrum. Scrum doesn't prescribe any format for backlog items. You can use tasks. Scrum doesn't care. Okay? If your team gets more value out of writing tasks directly, that's okay. If you're delivering value at the end of each sprint, Scrum doesn't care what your tickets look like. Don't let your tools or templates dictate your processes. Let your processes be shaped by the needs of your team and your customers. Importantly though, remember Scrum does say developers plan the work necessary to create the increment that meets the definition of done. Unlike the definition of ready, the definition of done is in the Scrum Guide. It is a formal description of conditions that must be met for an increment of software to be considered complete. So this is something that is created by the Scrum team for the Scrum team. It isn't pressed down upon them from management Although in scaled organizations, there may be a train level definition of done that has more input from leaders and teams outside of your immediate team. Regardless, the definition of done for your team may say user stories are needed, and that's fine too. You would need to use user stories in that case. Story points and planning poker. Story points, like user stories, aren't part of Scrum, but you're going to find them just about everywhere. Unsurprisingly, story points came out of extreme programming alongside user stories, though not at the same time. For story points, user stories were estimated using time-based estimates, ideal days. How long would a task take to complete? How long would a user story take to complete if you had no interruptions, no meetings, and you were fully focused 40 hours a week? There are a few problems with that approach. Surface level, we don't allocate 40 hours a week to our developers typically. We use 6-hour days, so 30 hours, and then that 10 hours remainder is meetings and interruption. But one of the other problems with using time estimates is that different developers might have different skill levels. And so a task that takes a senior developer 1 day may take a junior developer 3 days. This makes projecting completion dates and capacity difficult and time consuming. Frankly, sitting down with a development team and arguing over how many days something is going to take isn't really worth it. You're not going to get the type of precision you think you're going to get out of that. You might argue that, well, if you just assign those tasks out, then the developer doing the task is going to give you the estimate that they're going to do, and that'll be accurate enough also. Well, that's true. You can do that. That isn't in the spirit of Scrum. We want the team to talk and communicate and understand all the work that the team is doing. We are building a team. We aren't building a group of individuals that are running in their own parallel swim lane or their own silo. It is true that not every member of the team is going to have the skills to do every task that is required of the team. It is important that everybody has an understanding of the effort that the other team members are doing. And most of the time, that level of precision, figuring out if a task will be done in a day or 3 days in the estimate, isn't necessary and probably wouldn't be all that precise anyway. The team started using relative estimation in XP instead. So rather than asking how long will this take, they ask how big is this? How much effort is this required compared to something else we've already done, or maybe a baseline story that you've pulled out of the backlog that everybody can agree is a particular size. Doesn't matter what size that is, everybody could pull out some story. They could say, this is a 2-point story, we all agree on that. This is a 3-point story, we all agree on that. That doesn't matter where you start. What matters is where you go from there. If you define story A as a 3-point story, then what you're looking at now is story B compared to story A. Is that bigger? Is it smaller? Is it more effort? Is it less effort? Is there more risk? Is there more uncertainty or less? And that's what you base your estimate on. Story points are usually expressed using the Fibonacci sequence. That's a sequence that's found throughout nature. We see it in arrangements of sunflower seeds and pine cones. The sequence itself relates to the golden ratio and the golden spiral when that ratio is visualized. And when we talk about this being seen in nature in sunflower seeds, that's what we're talking about, the ratio that spiral creates inside that center of the sunflower. In Scrum, this is it's useful, and it's used because we have this increasing gap in the numbers. We're talking about an increase exponentially in effort. If you're looking at a 5-point story versus an 8-point story, it's not just going to be a little bit more work, it's going to be a lot more work. How much more, that's dependent on your team and your estimates, but the idea is that it's a significant amount. So when we talk about how we get to our estimates and we ensure each team member provides their personal estimate. We want to have that conversation and understand what the work is, but we don't want the senior developer telling every other developer that this is a 2-point story. You can ask questions about the actual work, but don't tell them what you're voting. Okay, so everybody has their planning poker cards. Either they're holding physical cards in their hands, unlikely, or they're using a plug-in in Jira or Azure DevOps, more likely. Product owner answers questions, maybe a technical lead answers questions. Once everybody has played their cards, the Scrum Master turns those over, revealing everybody's votes. So from here, if the votes are all closely aligned, we make a team agreement beforehand that we're either going to take the highest or lowest value. Teams usually go with the higher value. So if it was like, if all the votes were 2s and 3s, we would just go with a 3. We don't need to argue over that. When the votes are far apart, we ask both the person who voted with the highest number and the person that voted with the lowest number to explain their votes. Where is that disconnect? We re-vote after that if we need, or we can just have a discussion, answer questions, and then just say, okay, go ahead and put 5 points on this story. There are pitfalls of story points. Probably the biggest problem with story points is that they inevitably get equated to hours, defeating the purpose of having them all together. This is something I bring up frequently to teams. I usually say something to the effect of, if we equate them, then we should eliminate story points entirely and just use hour estimates. Most teams think I'm being sarcastic when I say that, but I really do believe that. Story points are an abstraction over time, complexity, and risk. They allow teams to estimate work without tying it directly to hours, creating that relative scale. Story points reflect how challenging one piece of work is compared to another. There is a relation to hours there. If something is more complex, it may take you longer to figure that out, but that's not necessarily true. There are other ways that you can go about estimating your backlog that isn't in story points. Scrum doesn't care. Let's talk about backlog refinement, formerly known as backlog grooming, although that term has fallen out of favor. The Scrum Guide simply says the product backlog is refined as needed. That's it, no events, no fixed cadence, just an ongoing activity. Product backlogs get messy fast. Refinement is how we ensure that items near the top are the appropriate items, they're sized appropriately, they are mutually understood by both the product owner and the developers. Without having that done, sprint planning turns into a half-day event. So the Scrum Guide says 4 hours, which I've never done. And I'm sure my teams are happy I've never done that. Sprint planning will turn into a much longer event, and the time is spent with the team asking all the questions. Maybe the product owner is writing acceptance criteria while we're trying to estimate it. Refinement breaks that planning session up into easier to digest pieces. A shorter meeting every week, you're reviewing the stories that are coming up, you're keeping those items and that work fresh in people's minds. Closely tied to refinement and often emerging from it is the definition of ready. And like I said, unlike the definition of done, the definition of ready isn't part of Scrum. The definition of ready is basically a checklist that defines when a user story is considered ready to be pulled into a sprint. It might include things like, are the acceptance criteria clear? Are dependencies resolved? Is the item small enough to be completed within a sprint? Has it been estimated? Does the team understand the work? Maybe you think that that's unnecessary. What it does is it sets a standard for preparedness, helping prevent all the common problems of committing to half-baked stories that derail the sprint. But it's not part of Scrum, it's not required. The Scrum Guide assumes that the selected items that you're bringing into the sprint are ready without prescribing how to do it. Still, a well-used definition of ready can be a powerful alignment tool, especially for new teams, distributed teams, or teams bringing on new team members. The key is you keep it lightweight and treat it more as a conversation starter and not a contract. Maybe it says that, you know, a story can't be 13 story points and be considered ready because it's too big. And that may be a good rule of thumb for 90% of the work you do. Maybe one story comes in randomly and it just can't be broken down any smaller. Without making it an incomplete piece of functionality. If you want to keep that complete piece of functionality, in this particular case, it has to be a 13. And we're just going to agree to go ahead and allow that this time. Right? And that way it's not a contract, it's just a way to start a conversation. To wrap it up, all the practices we've talked about today, user stories, story points, backlog refinement, definition of ready, these can be incredibly useful, but none of them are required by Scrum. They are optional. And importantly, they should never be used as a checklist to gauge your team's Agile or Scrum maturity. Let me repeat that. Complementary practices should never be used as a checklist to gauge your team's Agile maturity or Scrum maturity. That's not why they are there. If you have somebody, whether it's an Agile coach, your Scrum Master, your manager, and they're saying, you're not a mature Scrum team because you're not using user stories. You're not a mature Scrum team because you're estimating in hours and not story points. Well, that's not true. You can be a mature Agile team and not do those things. In fact, some of the most mature Scrum and Agile teams aren't doing those things because they used to do those things and they've matured to the point that they don't need that sort of rigid process. If somebody is telling you that, send them a link to this video. Well, that's it for today's look at complementary practices in Scrum. There are plenty more out there, and I'd love to hear which ones you found useful. Drop a comment, let me know, and let me know what you want me to cover next. Until next time, thank you, and take care.